It began like any other day in the U.S. District Court of Washington, D.C., but something about the atmosphere felt electric. Cameras were banned, but reporters still lined the hallway. The air outside buzzed with rumors. Senator John Kennedy, known for his biting wit and Southern charm, was about to testify in a case that was quietly gaining national attention. The courtroom was a picture of order oak benches, its polished floors, an American flag standing tall behind the bench. But underneath that order brewed tension. At the center of the storm was Judge Malcolm R. Gaines, a newly appointed federal judge with a reputation for being openly progressive, fiercely intellectual, and some whispered intolerant of old school conservatism, and there calmly seated at the witness table was Senator Kennedy. He didn't come with fanfare, no entourage, no stack of talking points, just a folder under one arm and that unmistakable Louisiana drawl, ready to slice through the silence. The case itself wasn't even about him. Officially, it was a federal review of congressional oversight concerning a controversial DOJ funding decision for universities accused of ideological discrimination. But everyone in the room knew this hearing wasn't about funding. It was a culture war on trial. Kennedy, for all intents and purposes, was about to become its mouthpiece. The judge began cold. "Senator Kennedy," Judge Gaines said, adjusting his glasses without looking up, "we appreciate your presence here today. Though some might question the necessity of a sitting senator offering legal opinions in this forum." It wasn't a greeting, it was a jab. It's polite on paper, patronizing in delivery. Kennedy, unfazed, simply smiled. "Well, Your Honor," he said, "some might also question the necessity of judges playing politics from the bench, but here we are." A few heads turned. Staffers froze. Even the stenographer paused for half a second. The judge narrowed his eyes, already irritated. "Let's keep things civil, Senator," he said. "Always," Kennedy replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm disguised as Southern hospitality. "But civility ain't the same thing as silence." That was the moment the crowd realized this wasn't going to be a typical hearing. For the next 30 minutes, Kennedy sat patiently as the court heard from legal scholars, DOJ reps, and university spokespeople. Every few minutes, Judge Gaines would find a way to needle him. "I assume, Senator, that your law degree hasn't been put to frequent use recently," the judge said at one point, clearly baiting him. Kennedy didn't take it. Yet instead, he leaned back, folded his arms, and waited, observing, listening, like a seasoned poker player refusing to show his hand too early. But the judge wasn't done. When it came time for Kennedy's official statement, Judge Gaines interrupted. The moment he began to speak, "Please keep your remarks brief. This isn't a campaign stop," he quipped, eliciting a few muffled chuckles from the law clerks. It was then, with the whole courtroom watching, that Kennedy slowly stood, placed both hands on the podium, and delivered a smile that was more dangerous than any outburst, because now he was ready to speak, and nobody in that courtroom, especially the judge, was ready for what he was about to say. Senator John Kennedy didn't rush his response. He knew the power of silence, how it could make words ring louder when they finally came. He let the courtroom sit in that uncomfortable pause, just long enough for the chuckles from the judge's jab to fade. Then he spoke. "Well, Your Honor," Kennedy began, voice smooth as molasses, "it's true I ain't stood in a courtroom like this one in a few years. But I reckon the law hasn't changed near as much as some people's understanding of it." The silence was instant. Whatever remained of the chuckling from the clerks evaporated. Kennedy hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Tone carried the weight of a man who'd been underestimated before and made, a habit of proving folks wrong. The judge adjusted his papers, clearly displeased. "We're here to discuss policy implications, Senator, not exchange philosophy," he said tersely. Kennedy, still calm, nodded. "Fair enough, so let's talk policy. Let's talk about how federal dollars are being funneled into institutions that punish kids for thinking the wrong thoughts. Let's talk about how diversity's become a one-way street. You're diverse until you think differently, then you're dangerous." A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. "You want my legal opinion?" he continued. "Well, I'm not a Harvard law professor, but I can still read the Constitution without needing a trigger warning. And that Constitution don't say a word about protecting your feelings. It talks about protecting your freedoms. Boom. That was the sentence that did it, the first direct hit. The courtroom sat in stunned quiet. The clerk stopped typing. Even the judge looked momentarily stunned, blinking at the sheer bluntness of Kennedy's point. Judge Gaines cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control. "Senator, this is a legal hearing, not a campaign event." Kennedy tilted his head, almost amused. "Yes, sir. But the problem is, these days, even legal hearings feel like campaign rallies, just depends on who's wearing the robes." Audible ones. The judge's face tensed. "Are you suggesting this court is biased?" Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned forward, resting one hand lightly on the stand. "I'm suggesting, Judge, that when a courtroom cares more about somebody's pronouns than their due process, we got a bigger problem than bias. We got decay," a reporter near the back whispered. "Did he just say that?" But it was no whisper to Kennedy. His voice carried clarity, confidence. He knew he was walking a tightrope, but he was used to it. The judge attempted to shift direction. "Senator Kennedy, if you continue politicizing this hearing," but Kennedy cut him off, not rudely, not loudly, but decisively. "I'm not politicizing anything. I'm just describing the politicizing that's already happened. I didn't bring this circus to town. I'm just trying to clean up after the elephants and the donkeys finished dancing through the courthouse." It was old school Kennedy. Part lawyer, part stand-up comic, part truth bomber. Even a few attendees who disagreed with him couldn't help but smile. Judge Gaines, on the other hand, was visibly losing his composure. His attempt to make an example out of Kennedy had backfired. The senator hadn't yelled. He hadn't name-called. He just dismantled him with plain logic and unapologetic clarity, and it wasn't over yet. As the judge fumbled with his notes, Kennedy gently placed his statement on the table and said, "Now, if y'all are done macking fun of my resume, I'd like to finish my point about taxpayer-funded intolerance." The judge gave a tight nod, permission given but barely. Kennedy's opening remarks had drawn blood. Now it was time to go deeper. The courtroom tried to recover its composure, but Kennedy wasn't about to let the tension dissipate. He'd only just started. And now, it was time to move from words to evidence. He reached into the slim leather folder he had brought. No staff, no legal team, just one folder, and pulled out a stack of printed documents. The room watched as he laid them gently on the table, each with colored tabs and scribbled notes in the margins. These weren't props. They were receipts. "Your Honor," Kennedy said, lifting the first sheet, "this here is a case from Yale Law School. A student was punished for circulating a satirical flyer about a mandatory diversity event. Nothing racist, nothing violent, just a joke. The university said it made other students feel unsafe. Know what the student got? A mandatory re-education session." He paused, letting the absurdity hang in the air. "Now, I don't know about you, Judge, but where I come from, jokes are protected by the First Amendment, even bad ones. But apparently Ivy League deans now outrank James Madison." A few of the younger lawyers shifted in their seats. Kennedy's point wasn't just rhetorical. He had backup. He held up another case. "Here's another. University of Pennsylvania. Christian student group asked to hold a debate on gender in sports. You'd think that'd be legal, right? Well, not according to the campus tribunal. They were accused of platforming hate. Their funding was pulled." Judge Gaines interrupted for the first time in minutes. "Senator Kennedy, these aren't judicial decisions. These are campus administrative matters." Kennedy nodded, but his eyes didn't blink. "Sure, they start as campus matters. But guess who's paying for the campuses? Taxpayers. And guess who's approving the funds that go to these ideological playgrounds? Congress. So if a university takes federal dollars and then turns around and stomps on free speech like a roach in a kitchen, well, sir, I'd say that's Congress's business, and yours too." That line made the courtroom rustle again. The judge's jaw tightened, but Kennedy wasn't done. He flipped to the next document. "Let's talk about Berkeley," he said. A conservative journalist invited to speak on campus, Antifa showed up. Fights broke out. The university canceled the event not to protect him, but to avoid offending student groups. You want to guess how much federal grant money that same university received that year? $176 million. You tell me if that sounds like accountability? This was no longer a debate. This was an indictment with footnotes. Judge Gaines tried again to redirect. These are emotional anecdotes, not constitutional violations. Kennedy cocked his head, amused. Well, they're only emotional if you've got a conscience. Otherwise, they're just numbers and names. They paint a picture clearer than any Supreme Court ruling. America's public institutions are being turned into echo chambers, and the judges defending Mr. Acton more like referees in a rigged game. That hit hard, because now it wasn't just about the cases. It was about the bench. I'm not here to call you a bad judge, Kennedy added, voice calm. I'm here to call out a bad trend. When judges treat the Constitution like it's a living document, they forget that even living things can rot. Silence again. Only the sound of Kennedy gently placing the documents back into his folder. Now, if this court is still interested in hearing about the law, I've got 3 more examples, 2 Supreme Court precedents, and a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg that'd probably make half this room faint. He smiled gently. Shall I continue? For a brief moment, the courtroom stood still. The air felt thick, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Kennedy had everyone's attention, not just with his facts, but with the way he carried them. Not as a bombastic senator throwing red meat, but like a man with nothing to prove and everything to expose. Judge Gaines leaned forward. Proceed, he said tightly, his tone suggesting he was regretting the invitation. Kennedy adjusted his tie and pulled out a dog-eared Uka biography of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Several eyebrows lifted. This was unexpected. Kennedy. The conservative lion, quoting the liberal icon? Was it a stunt? Now, Your Honor, Kennedy began, opening the book and flipping to a tabbed page. I know you and I don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. That's all right. But I figure if a quote's good, it don't matter who said it. He cleared his throat. In 1997, Justice Ginsburg was asked whether universities should be allowed to suppress speech in the name of social harmony. She said, and I quote, "There is no constitutional right not to be offended. Solution to offensive speech is more speech, not enforced silence." He paused and looked up. That ain't me saying it. That's RBG. The judge blinked. Lips tight. Kennedy let the silence speak. And here we are, Kennedy continued. Universities, many of which receive millions in taxpayer money, are punishing speech in the name of feelings, not threats, not violence, just plain OL. Disagreement. And folks like you, Judge, are calling that progress. He stepped closer to the bench, not too close, just enough to fill the space with his presence. I respect the bench, I do. But when judges mock senators for defending the First Amendment, you don't look impartial. You look complicit. Murmurs rippled across the room. The bailiff gave a quick glance around, but nobody dared interrupt. Judge Gaines responded slowly. Senator Kennedy, this court isn't on trial today. The DOJ's discretionary grant policy is. Kennedy leaned on the table and looked directly at the judge. And what do you think happens? Judge, when grants are used to support speech policing, what happens when free speech is chilled by the fear of lost funding? What's that called? Aye. Tapped the folder. That's called state-sanctioned censorship. Whether you like the words being spoken or not, the judge's gavel hovered but didn't fall. Kennedy had boxed him in, using the very legal principles the court was supposed to uphold. And here's something else RBG said, Kennedy added. She said dissent speaks to a future age. It's not just to say I disagree. It's to say I disagree, and I hope you'll come around. He smiled not cruelly, but firmly. Well, Your Honor, I disagree. I hope one day you'll come around. Till then, I'll be here reminding folks that speech isn't violence. Disagreement isn't oppression. The judge didn't respond. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew Kennedy had just flipped the script quoting. The late liberal justice to shame a progressive judge into remembering the Constitution they both claimed to serve, it wasn't. Loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was brutal, and it left the courtroom stunned. After Kennedy's RBG moment, the courtroom atmosphere changed. No longer was this a senator fumbling through a political stunt. This was a masterclass in constitutional jiu-jitsu. Even the judge sat more cautiously now, his earlier smirk nowhere to be found. But just when the dust began to settle, the court called its next witness. Professor Ethan Larimore, constitutional law scholar from Stanford Young, sharply dressed, and confident in the kind of way that usually only comes from tenure and Twitter followers. He took the stand with a polished smile, glancing at Kennedy as if he were about to play chess with a checkers player. Professor Larimore, the judge, began, "You've reviewed the senator's claims about campus speech and constitutional rights. Do you find them legally sound?" Larimore didn't miss a beat. "With all due respect, no, Your Honor. Senator Kennedy's rhetoric is passionate, but misleading. These examples he's given are administrative choices made by institutions, exercising their own free association rights. The Constitution doesn't apply to every college policy decision." Kennedy chuckled softly and leaned back in his chair. "Professor," he said, "I assume you teach constitutional law, right?" "Yes, I do," Larimore replied, folding his hands. "Well, let's walk through a little pop quiz together." Larimore smirked gladly. Kennedy stood up and paced slowly toward the witness stand. "First question," Kennedy began. "Does the First Amendment protect offensive speech?" "Yes," Larimore said cautiously. "Good. Now, does the government have the right to revoke funding from an institution because of the speech it allows?" Larimore hesitated. "Only under certain conditions, if the speech violates federal law or incites violence." Kennedy interrupted. "But not if it simply offends someone, right?" "That's correct, all right. Now, if a federally funded university punishes a student for holding an unpopular viewpoint, SCI on gender identity, doesn't that become a matter of public concern if the institution is bound by Title V or Title X funding clauses?" Larimore paused again. "It could, yes, depending on the specifics." "Glad we agree on that. So when a university disciplines a student for stating a religious belief that contradicts campus orthodoxy, and that university receives millions in federal grants, or saying that's not the government tacitly endorsing censorship?" Shifted in his seat. "Senator, that's an oversimplification." Kennedy leaned in, eyes sharp. "Professor, I ain't asking for a TED Talk. I'm asking for a yes or no." The room went quiet again. Larimore looked to the judge, but the judge said nothing. "It could be interpreted as such, yes," Larimore finally admitted. Kennedy smiled. "Thank you. Now I know you're a man of reason." He turned back toward the court. "You see, folks, this isn't about whether people have the right to be woke. They do. It's America. You can believe the moon's made of cheese if you want. But the minute the government starts punishing people for not joining the cheese cult, we've got a problem." Laughter, light, restrained, but very real, broke out in the gallery. Larimore looked visibly irritated. "In fact," Kennedy said, holding up another file, "here's a letter from the Department of Education threatening to pull grants from a Christian college for failing to use preferred pronouns on official documents. That sound like neutrality to you, Professor?" Larimore didn't answer, just stared. "That's what I thought," Kennedy said, sliding the file back into his folder. "See, folks like Professor Larimore, they've built careers out of complicating simple truths. But the Constitution doesn't need subtitles." The room was no longer just a courtroom, it was a theater, and Kennedy was directing every scene. After dismantling, Professor Larimore, with the elegance of a seasoned litigator and the timing of a stand-up comic, Kennedy didn't sit down. No, he stood still, calm, like a preacher before the final sermon. The judge looked tense. The media rose in the back of the room, had their cameras rolling. The headlines were already writing themselves, but Kennedy wasn't finished. "Your Honor," he said with a surprising softness, "I got one last point to make, if I may." Judge Gaines didn't respond for several seconds. He knew this wasn't Going to be a procedural motion or a legal citation? It was something else, something heavier. Proceed, the judge muttered. Kennedy pulled a small, folded note from his coat pocket. This, said, holding it up as a letter I received. Last week from a 19-year-old student at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. Her name is Rachel. She wrote me because she watched one of my hearings on YouTube and said I quote, "I didn't think anybody in Washington remembered people like me existed." He paused. Rachel got suspended for refusing to attend a mandatory gender identity re-education seminar. Not because she protested. Not because she disrupted anything. But because she respectfully declined to participate. Her words, not mine. A hush fell again. Even the court reporter's fingers slowed. She asked me in that letter, Senator Kennedy, if the Constitution doesn't protect me from this, what does? Kennedy lowered the note and stared directly at the bench. That's the question, ain't it, Your Honor? If the Constitution doesn't protect a 19-year-old girl from being punished for her beliefs, what the hell are we even doing here? The judge stiffened in his chair. Now I understand we don't all agree politically. I'm a conservative. You may not be. But the law ain't supposed to care what party you belong to. It's supposed to care about principles. Kennedy took a step forward. And let me tell you something. When judges sit up there, he gestured at the bench, and mock elected officials for standing up for free speech, they're not just mocking us. They're mocking the people we represent. Rachel, her parents. All of them. You could hear the leather of the judge's chair creak as he shifted, clearly uncomfortable. And Your Honor, Kennedy added with slow, measured gravity, I don't work for you. I work for them. He dropped the note gently onto the witness table, and I intend to keep showing up in places like this weather. Mocked. Or not until people like Rachel don't have to write letters to senators just to feel protected. By the First Amendment, for a long moment no one spoke. No legal jargon, no objections, no smug responses, just silence. Kennedy finally nodded toward the judge. I thank the court for its time, he said, stepping back. Then, with the poise of a man who knew the moment would echo beyond the walls of the courtroom, Kennedy packed up his papers, turned, and walked straight toward the back doors, leaving a stunned room behind him. No mic drop. No, it's dramatic music. Just truth. Brutal, quiet truth. And that truth, caught on camera, would go viral before Kennedy even reached the sidewalk outside the courthouse. Steps had seen hundreds of press conferences before, but none quite like this. The moment Senator Kennedy emerged through the grand wooden doors, a sea of reporters surged forward like a tidal wave. They weren't just chasing a soundbite. They were chasing the moment that had already started to trend online. Within 20 minutes of leaving the courtroom, the clip of Kennedy saying, "If the Constitution doesn't protect her, what the hell are we even doing here?" was the #1 trending video on X, formerly Twitter. Major news outlets like Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and The Hill blasted it out with headlines that told wildly different stories, but everyone was talking about it. Fox News. Kennedy goes nuclear in courtroom showdown with woke judge. MSNBC. Senator John Kennedy's latest tirade sparks constitutional debate. The Hill. Kennedy reads letter from student hand, leaves courtroom silent. And beneath the headlines, the reactions poured in. Thousands of tweets. Hundreds of video reactions. Think pieces from law professors. Op-eds from student activists. And a dozen university PR teams scrambling to issue statements clarifying ongoing policy reviews. Kennedy didn't hold a press conference. He didn't need to. The moment was already bigger than him. But still, standing in front of the microphones, he gave the reporters exactly what they came for. "Senator," shouted one CNN correspondent, "did you intend to provoke the judge like that?" Kennedy raised an eyebrow. "No, ma'am. I intended to provoke the truth. If the truth makes somebody squirm, that's between them and their conscience." Another reporter from Politico pushed forward. "You think it was appropriate to call out the judge's mockery in open court?" Kennedy smiled wryly. "I think it was appropriate to remind the judge he's not above the Constitution. And besides, if he can dish it out, he ought to be able to take it." The crowd buzzed. Reporters frantically scribbled. A few aides tried to usher Kennedy toward a waiting vehicle, but he waved them off. Then came a young reporter from a student paper. She looked nervous, barely older than Rachel from the letter. "Senator Kennedy," she asked, voice trembling just slightly, "do you really believe things have gone that far on college campuses? That students are afraid to speak freely?" Kennedy turned toward her, face softening. "Darlin', I don't believe it. I know it. I get letters from folks like you every week. Smart kids, thoughtful kids, scared to raise their hand in class because they don't want to be called a bigot or a fascist for asking a question. That ain't education. That's indoctrination. And it's my job to call it out, Tevin, if I've got to do it in a courtroom full of cameras." Her recorder shook in her hand. "Don't ever be afraid to ask questions," he added. "That's how you keep the Republic alive." The crowd fell silent again. That was the second mic drop moment of the day, and this one came without a podium or gavel. By that evening, Kennedy's office was flooded with over 20,000 emails. A GoFundMe launched by free speech advocates raised nearly $100,000 in 24 hours. To support legal challenges to campus censorship, Rachel, the student who wrote him the letter, posted a video saying she never expected him to read it, much less carry it into court. But he had. And now, the fight was national. Kennedy didn't just respond to the judge. He responded to every student, every parent, and every American who'd watched the scales of justice tip just a little too far. And now, the whole country was watching. The viral moment didn't just capture the public's imagination, it ignited a wildfire in Washington. D.C. One courtroom exchange had transformed into a national conversation on judicial conduct, free speech, and the limits of so-called wokeness in legal institutions. And Senator John Kennedy was at the center of it. The next morning, the Senate Judiciary Committee was buzzing, not just with the usual hum of legislative business, but with a quiet tension. Every senator had seen the video. Every aide had a stack of new press clippings on their desk. And by 9 a.m., Kennedy had already been called into 3 private meetings, too friendly. One less so, Senator Josh Hawley clapped Kennedy on the back as he entered the committee room. "You just lit a fire that's going to burn for weeks," he said with a grin. But not everyone was laughing across the aisle. Dope. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse had taken to the morning news shows, calling Kennedy's courtroom appearance a dangerous blurring of the lines between legislative oversight and judicial intimidation. Kennedy responded with characteristic bite. "I don't need to intimidate anyone," he said during a live appearance on Fox News. "I just need to remind M what job they're supposed to be doing, and who they're doing it for. Judges don't answer to senators. But they do answer to the Constitution. And I'll be damned if I let a robe become a shield for arrogance." That quote alone was enough to launch another round of headlines. But behind the media storm, something more serious was brewing. A formal review of Judge Gaines' conduct. The American Bar Association issued a carefully worded statement saying it was deeply concerned about reports of a judge mocking an elected official during a legal proceeding. Legal scholars from both liberal and conservative backgrounds began weighing in on all in agreement with Kennedy. But nearly all agreeing, the moment warranted serious scrutiny. Meanwhile, students across the country, especially in conservative and libertarian circles, began organizing online under hashtags like #StandWithKennedy and #FreeToSpeak. A viral TikTok featuring Kennedy's courtroom speech cut with student protest footage hit over 10 million views in 3 days. Back in D.C., Kennedy wasn't slowing down. He introduced a resolution titled the Campus Expression and Judicial Decorum Accountability Act, a proposal calling for clearer boundaries on judicial commentary during public proceedings, and additional protections for students facing ideological retaliation in public universities. Reporters tried to corner Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the bill. His response? Classic deflection. "I haven't read the resolution yet. Let's focus on funding priorities." But others weren't so dismissive. Senator Kyrsten Sinema, known for straddling political lines, said she was open to reviewing whether the courts are reflecting the public's trust, undermining it. The true shocker, though, came from Senator Dick Durbin, who, while disagreeing with Kennedy's tone, said, We need to be mindful that judges serve the people, not themselves. Arrogance on the bench helps no one. Kennedy's critics called his actions performative. His supporters called them courageous. But no one could deny they were effective. Every news outlet had replayed his final courtroom words. Students were quoting him on signs. Professors were analyzing him in classrooms, and even his opponents in Congress were watching their words more carefully in committee hearings. Kennedy, meanwhile, stayed on message. "This ain't about left or right," he told NBC. "It's about the folks who feel like they're being talked down to by people in power, judges. Professors, politicians. I'm just giving those folks a voice. I don't plan to stop anytime soon." The silence from Judge Gaines had been deafening for nearly a week. For days. As Kennedy's words looped on every social media feed, podcast, and primetime show, the man at the center of the controversy, the federal judge who mocked a sitting U.S. senator in open court, remained utterly silent. His chambers refused interviews. The federal judiciary issued no statements. Clerks offered the standard, no comment. But pressure was mounting, and the walls were closing in. And finally, in a quiet Thursday morning, Judge Lawrence Gaines released a statement. At first glance, it appeared measured and professional. "It was never my intention to disrespect Senator Kennedy or diminish the critical role the legislative branch plays in the balance of American governance. Judicial independence is a cornerstone of democracy, and maintaining decorum in the courtroom is essential to that independence." That was the opening paragraph. Then came the turn. However, it is equally important that lawmakers refrain from theatrics in spaces where the rule of law, not sound bites, must take precedence. In hindsight, perhaps my tone was misunderstood, but I stand by the substance of my courtroom management. The reaction was swift and brutal. Within 30 minutes, Kennedy was live on Fox News. "Well, there you have it, folks," he said, straight-faced. "Apparently standing up for free speech and reading a letter from a student is now considered theatrics. That judge didn't just double down, he poured concrete over his own credibility." On CNN, legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin cautiously supported the judge's right to defend himself, but admitted the statement lacked humility. On Twitter, the hashtag theatrics or truth began trending, and by noon, Senator Kennedy had released his own written reply. When the American people express their frustrations through their elected representatives, it is not theater, it is democracy in action. If a federal judge cannot distinguish between the two, perhaps it is time for Congress to review the standards of judicial temperament more closely. The entire controversy gained new momentum. Multiple House Republicans began calling for an oversight hearing, not to discipline the judge per se, but to explore how ideological bias might be eroding judicial neutrality. Even Senate Democrats began to feel the heat from their constituents. In a surprisingly bipartisan move, a letter co-signed by Senators Kennedy, Manchin, Sinema, and even Cory Booker was sent to the Chief Justice of the United States, requesting clarification on what mechanisms exist for reviewing judicial conduct in cases where courtroom behavior appears to cross professional boundaries. Legal blogs exploded with commentary. One article on Lawfare titled, "When Judges Clap Back, a Dangerous New Norm," laid out the risks of turning courtrooms into political arenas and warned that Judge Gaines had, perhaps unintentionally, done just that. Meanwhile, back in Louisiana, Kennedy's home district saw a spike in voter enthusiasm. His next town hall drew record crowds. And in a Q&A session, when asked what he thought of the judge's statement, Kennedy leaned into the microphone and said, "I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed." You'd think a man with a gavel would understand. What silence would have protected better than what that statement just blew up? It wasn't just a line. It was a kill shot. Memes followed. T-shirts were printed. Clips of Kennedy's response aired in political ads, student rallies, and even a few college debate tournaments, and Judge Gaines. He returned to his docket and silence. But his reputation had taken a hit, one that wouldn't fade anytime soon. His name, once known only to those in the legal world, was now being spoken in dorm rooms, boardrooms, and newsrooms nationwide. And Senator John Kennedy. He wasn't just surviving the firestorm, he was thriving in it. As the days passed, it became clear Senator John Kennedy had struck a nerve. The moment that began with a courtroom smirk and a sarcastic judge had snowballed into something far larger. Kennedy wasn't just the subject of viral clips anymore. He was now being talked about as the face of a growing wave, a renewed demand for judicial accountability and First Amendment protections. And then Kennedy did what no one expected. He didn't gloat. He didn't drag Judge Gaines through another round of public humiliation. Instead, he turned the energy into action. At a packed press conference on Capitol Hill, Kennedy stepped to the podium flanked by a bipartisan group of lawmakers, educators, and even to students, one of whom was Rachel, the girl whose letter he had read aloud in court. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kennedy began, holding up a fresh stack of papers. "This here is the Student Free Expression and Judicial Transparency Act, and it's about time Congress did something besides talk." The bill, in its simplest form, did two things. It created new legal protections for students, punished by public institutions for constitutionally protected speech. It established a new judicial conduct reporting requirement, forcing federal judges to submit quarterly reports detailing complaints made against them, both formal and informal, so the public could better assess courtroom temperament and bias. The media ate it up. Fox News praised Kennedy for walking the walk. MSNBC, while skeptical of the motivations, admitted that transparency in the judiciary is a topic long overdue for serious attention. But most surprisingly, C-SPAN's live stream of the press conference broke viewing records. People weren't just watching. They were engaging, commenting, clipping, sharing. The courtroom clash had done something. Few political moments managed it bridged generational divides. Older Americans saw Kennedy as a patriot standing his ground. Younger audiences saw him as someone willing to challenge an arrogant establishment. Even those who didn't agree with his politics couldn't deny the power of what had happened. And the Judge Gaines released a second, much shorter statement. Senator Kennedy's remarks and his proposed legislation. "I will refrain from additional public comment at this time, and will continue to uphold the duties of my office." Translation: he was backing off hard. Meanwhile, Kennedy toured universities, appeared on late-night shows, and even guest lectured. At a law school where students stood and applauded when he walked in, one viral TikTok showed Kennedy walking through a campus with the caption, "When your grandpa roasts a federal judge and still makes time to defend your First Amendment rights." The comments: "I don't agree with him on everything, but I'd vote for him. Respect for standing up when it counted. That's how you clap back with class." And perhaps the most telling one: "This is what courage looks like in a suit." By the end of the month, Kennedy's bill had 34 co-sponsors. Analysts began whispering, 2028, presidential potential. But Kennedy waved it off. "I'm not running for president," he said in a radio interview. "I'm running toward the fight like I've always done," whether it's a woke professor, a smug judge, or anyone else who forgets what that Constitution actually says. And that's what made the story so unforgettable. It wasn't just that the judge mocked him. It was that Kennedy responded not with vengeance, not with vanity, but with vision. He turned a courtroom insult into a national movement. And in doing so, reminded America that brutal truth still has a place in civil discourse, and sometimes it takes just one voice to make the whole country listen.